Welcome to the Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Josh May about issues in neuroethics in the law and also mental disorders and moral responsibility.
Thanks for listening. Well, I'm happy to introduce Josh May, professor of philosophy and psychology at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. Josh's research focuses on issues at the intersection of ethics and science, and he's written many op-eds and public-facing articles in addition to many more traditional scholarly publications. He's the author of Regard for Reason in the Moral Mind, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2018. And with Matt King, he's the co-editor of Agency and Mental Disorder, Philosophical Dimensions, which was also published by Oxford University Press, and that one came out in 2022. Josh's most recent book is Neuroethics, Agency in the Age of Brain Science, published by Oxford University Press in 2023. And that includes a chapter on free will and engages throughout with various legal cases. And we've invited Josh to talk about some of those issues on the podcast today. So thanks for joining us, Josh. Welcome to the podcast. Can you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will and responsibility?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, guys. Real pleasure to be on the podcast. Yeah, I really never thought I would be a philosopher. Never in my wildest dreams. I didn't really know that there was such a thing, even though apparently I sounded like one from way back when. I remember one time I must have been ranting about something, and a friend in high school said, "Dude, you should be a philosopher." And I remember thinking, "What? What? That's not a thing. What do you mean?" And now here I am. It's a weird situation for me. But I've always been interested in ethics and science, and really I got into college. Well, I didn't really plan to go to college, but I went because my friends were going, and I was interested in math and science, but fell into a philosophy class. It was actually logic, and I was just blown away that you could formalize arguments in this way. I think I always was interested in arguments and ideas, but I never really had thought that was a possibility for me to really formalize these things and have it as a career. But I always thought about philosophical questions, and including issues of free will. I remember one of the earliest sort of philosophical thoughts I think that I had was probably about free will. I remember thinking about the insanity defense and thinking that it was kind of puzzling that we have this demarcation of some people could be not guilty by reason of insanity. And the thought I had back then, remember I was a teenager, was something like, well, isn't anybody who goes and kills people callously insane? Like by definition, almost, how could we demarcate some of them? Some of these like serial killers might be insane or not. And I thought that was an interesting puzzle. Of course, I think I have maybe some more sophisticated thoughts about that now, but I certainly don't have it all figured out. So that's a little bit about how I came into things.
That's cool.
Yeah, very cool. In your book, Neuroethics, you devote a chapter to free will and discuss several of the neuroscientific challenges to free will that we've discussed in earlier episodes of the podcast. Before we ask you about those challenges, could you describe the key case from neurolaw that you start the chapter with?
Sure. Yeah. So this is the case of Herbert Weinstein, not to be confused with Harvey Weinstein. These are very different examples and apparently pronounced differently. This is part of my deep research. That's Weinstein is Herbert Weinstein. So he was this a retired ad executive. It's like 50s, 60s, and he got into an argument with his wife. She apparently sort of scratched his face, and then he strangled her, and then pushed her out of their 12-story apartment in Manhattan and tried to make it look like a suicide. But some bystanders saw from down below, so there were witnesses, and this was not something that was normal for him. There wasn't a history of violence and all of that, but he also seemed like he was reacting to the whole situation very oddly. Like he was calm, didn't really seem to care that he was being charged with murder. So he seemed like he was acting out of character, and his defense team thought, well, maybe we should get his brain scanned. And so they did find that there was this large cyst around his frontal lobe It's this arachnoid cyst that grows in this layer that protects the brain. So not exactly like a normal tumor, but basically kind of like a tumor pressing on his frontal lobe. And it was large, about the size of an orange. And it's really one of the cases that first got someone to get a reduced sentence because of a brain scan. And it wasn't really part of the actual proceedings. Really, it was that the prosecution got scared that the jury would see this image and, maybe even fully acquit him. And so the prosecution decided to go for a lesser sentence. They went with manslaughter instead of second-degree murder, I believe it was. And that was one of the first cases in the sort of late 90s that really had some brain imaging play a major role in reducing a criminal sentence.
Yeah, that's an interesting case.
Very interesting.
So what do you make of the Weinstein case? Do you think he lacked free will and moral responsibility given the cyst? Or, more generally, how do you think brain abnormalities affect freedom and responsibility?
Yeah, I think it's really tempting to say, well, he had this tumor and probably played some role in his uncharacteristic behavior. And so it seems like it should at least mitigate blame or punishment. But I'm not so sure that we should jump to that kind of conclusion. I mean, we do mitigate blame for people when we feel like it was out of their control, or at least they had less control. So like if Taylor, I try to hand you your expensive cell phone and I have a muscle spasm and I drop it, there you'd say, well, okay, can't really be blamed for it. At least I hope you wouldn't blame me for it. And, that's kind of normal part of everyday life. If somebody couldn't really control their action, then we say, well, maybe they shouldn't be blamed or not blamed so much. So certainly if somebody has a tumor that is, pressing on the self-control part of their brain, as if there is a special part, then, of course we would say then they should have some mitigated blame. That's just kind of ordinary life. But the fact that somebody has a tumor, I don't think necessarily says anything about their freedom or responsibility. If we have a case where the tumor is pressing on their frontal lobe, we don't necessarily know what that's causing psychologically. Frontal lobe is involved with judgment and decision-making, but it's also involved with aspects of personality. And I think that's a big difference. So if it is compromising control, it's like the muscle spasm. And then we might say, yes, it makes sense to mitigate responsibility. But if it's, pushing on parts of the brain that causes Weinstein to be just more of a hothead, right? To just affect his personality, be a bit more of a jerk, then I think we kind of have to say that that's not necessarily going to affect freedom and thus responsibility. Otherwise, we'd have to say that everyone, is going to have mitigated responsibility because, we couldn't control aspects of our personality, our genes or our parents and how they raised us. Similarly, Weinstein couldn't control that the cyst was pushing on part of his brain. But if it was just affecting, aspects of his personality, I don't think we have necessarily the grounds to say that he has lesser responsibility. But the fact is we just don't know when it's pushing on a big area of the brain. It's hard to tell exactly, is it compromising self-control or is it just changing aspects of personality?
Yeah. I'm assuming that back then we didn't have the technology to be able to tell. Do we now? If somebody had a brain tumor, and are we able to make that judgment about what causes what?
Yeah, I don't think so. Maybe we're getting close, and I have to be careful here because every time you say something now about predicting technology, you get something like ChatGPT coming along, and really it's funny because this book got published, well, at least it got sent off to the press before ChatGPT really hit the scene. And, AI generally is now really transforming neuroscience, and it's advancing it pretty rapidly. And really just about a month ago, Elon Musk's company, Neuralink, just released video of its first human who's received their implant, and shows the guy who can play chess with his mind, move a cursor with his mind. So it's pretty impressive. Still, though, there are a lot of limitations, and we really just fundamentally don't know how firing of neurons gives rise to very specific psychological states, like particular thoughts, self-control. it's still really this deep mystery. We might be able to use artificial intelligence to try to get performance out of people and systems, but a lot of that's a black box. We don't really know exactly how it works. So it's very difficult to know just from activity in one particular person's brain exactly which psychological functions are compromised. Now, you could combine that with other evidence, and so it might be that using brain imaging or other kinds of neuroscientific evidence could be combined with behavioral evidence and tests to try to get a better understanding, but it's still incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question here too? So I think it seems like, there's lots of aspects of our personalities, identities that are affected by our genes and other things that are sort of outside of our control that predate us in some sense. But then we also have a chance to reflect on those things, maybe in some cases respond either by accepting or by trying to change what we're sort of endowed with. Do you think that maybe that there's kind of a potential difference with something like a tumor that might affect someone's personality to make it more likely that they respond as a hothead, whereas someone who maybe had that as part of their personality but never fought it for years and years and years and just sort of took ownership of it, they might be more responsible than the one with the tumor?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that could be a difference between someone who has a tumor and who doesn't. I think another factor it's relevant is actually it comes out of a paper that Annalee Jefferson wrote for this volume that Matt King and I edited. And she says, well, when you have a tumor, it's often not noticed. And so you can't really tell that there's this change in your personality. And so that's something that you can't quite understand and cope with. Whereas maybe features of your personality that you sort of grow up and develop with, you might have more of a sense that they're there and how to shape them. I think those are relevant differences, but they're not sort of in principle differences, and they won't happen in every case. I think there are a lot of situations where, somebody might be aware of their personality defects, but they can't change them any more than someone who has a brain tumor could. Or vice versa. There could be somebody who has a brain tumor and it affects their personality in certain ways, but they can still use various kinds of strategies to cope with that. Right. So I think it just depends on the case.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
This is a common theme of the book, actually, which is very unsatisfying philosophically. you hear me just keep saying, it depends.
It depends.
Yeah. I think that's a common theme in philosophy in general. It's like, well, it depends.
Right.
All right, let's move on to the general neuroscientific challenge to free will. We've talked about some of this in some of our previous episodes, but what's your overall assessment of this neuroscientific challenge?
Well, in general, I don't think that neuroscience shows that we lack free will. I think that it does force us to maybe revise our conception of how we think of free will, but not fully reject it. And we could get into some of the details about those challenges, but they are familiar from a lot of people. Just thinking about really the headlines. I mean, there are people like Robert Sapolsky, this famous neuroscientist, who just wrote a book saying that humans don't have free will based on neuroscience and science more generally. But a lot of them will focus on how it is true that neuroscience, cognitive science generally is showing to us that many of our choices are driven by rather automatic and unconscious processes. And you can quibble about any particular study, but that does seem to be a general finding that most of us tend to think that it's our conscious decisions that play this major role in our choices, but it looks like there's a lot of automatic and unconscious processes. And some people respond to that by saying, okay, well, that means that we don't have free will, because I thought that to have free will, it had to be my conscious choices that were controlling all of my actions. But I think that's a little bit too fast. There's a great analogy that comes from some other areas of philosophy, really, ultimately, I think, meta-ethics. But you can think about it in terms of different kinds of concepts that we sometimes ultimately think show that there is no such thing, like with witches. We think, well, we discovered there's no real magic, or I don't know what we discovered exactly, but discovered some things and figured out there are no witches, right? Because part of the concept of witch is that there are these magical women, I guess, I don't know. And we say, well, there's no such thing, so there are no witches. But other things lead us to just sort of revise our conception rather than reject it. And the analogy here I like is solidity. So it looks like science has shown us that actually things that are solid are mostly empty space. And that doesn't lead us to say that there are no things that are solid. It just leads us to say that things are a little bit different than we thought they were.
Yeah.
And I think free will is one of those cases that, sure, we're realizing that many of our decisions are influenced by pretty much automatic and unconscious processes, not entirely, but that could lead us to say, well, maybe it's just a little bit different than we thought. And that puts a burden on us to say, well, what is this other conception of how we can be free yet still driven by unconscious forces? And the best I've come up with is this kind of corporate model of agency. And I say, well, like there are other kinds of corporations, like Apple is a corporation, and we think of its like CEO as having a special privileged role in the corporation, which it does, and that's kind of like our conscious minds. It does play a special role, but there are a lot of things that happen in the great corporation of Apple that Tim Cook, the CEO, is not aware of. And that doesn't mean that it's not an agent or an agency. Actually, we do call them like agencies often. And I think same thing for us. We might have this sort of conscious self that is kind of like a CEO, but I don't think that we have to say the only decisions that come out of that could be free and exercising agency come from those conscious decisions or come from the CEO. We are complex agents, just like complex agencies. And so our agency arises in that way as well. We've got some conscious choices that play a role, but there's a lot of things that are automatic and unconscious. But that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, in another chapter of your neuroethics book, you discuss mental disorders and moral responsibility. You note that it's common, but ultimately naive, to think of the mentally ill as clear examples of individuals lacking full-fledged freedom and responsibility. Could you describe the 2 homicides in Texas that you discuss in that chapter and explain whether and why the defendants were found criminally liable?
Sure. Yeah. Although maybe first a caveat. So these are 2 cases that involve murder, but I feel like it's always important to flag that, of course, people with mental illnesses are not inherently dangerous. But these 2 cases got a lot of attention because they involved tragic loss of life. So this is a interesting pair of cases. They both did happen in Texas. And the first one, well known, of Andrea Yates. And she was a mother of 5 who was struggling with major depression and schizophrenia. But after having her 5th child, she decided to go off her medications, and she ultimately drowned all 5 of her kids in the bathtub. So she's charged with murder, but she was found not guilty by reason of insanity. See, so I can continue to think about this question from my youth. It still puzzles me. But, there are these other cases, like Eddie Ray Routh is the other one, and that's not what happened in his case. But he was a former Marine. He served in Iraq, and after he returned home, had severe PTSD, like a lot of vets. And 2 other vets tried to help him, by taking him out to a shooting range. They're just trying to bond with them and just kind of get back to old times kind of thing. And of course, this wasn't very good for his PTSD, kind of triggered him. And he ultimately shot and killed both of the other guys who took him there. And one of them was this famous sniper, Chris Kyle. He's the subject of this film, American Sniper. I don't know. Have you guys seen this movie?
Yeah, I saw that a while back.
It's good. I mean, it's directed by Clint Eastwood. It's great, but it's really focused on Chris Kyle, not on Routh. But this case came out later where Routh did shoot and kill this guy Kyle, who's really this kind of celebrated sniper. And so these are very different cases. They both involve mental illness, both involve the loss of life. But we have one that's found not guilty by reason of insanity, the other who is not.
So what are some reasons someone might take what you call the naive view that having a mental disorder itself implies something about somebody's freedom or moral responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, this is another one of those things where intuitively it makes a lot of sense to say, well, if someone has a mental illness, then that involves dysfunction in the mind. So it's almost by definition that, they don't really necessarily have full agency or, freedom or responsibility. Really, mental illness affects how people perceive the world, how they make choices. And so I think it makes sense, but honestly, I think that also this naive kind of picture stems from a tendency to stigmatize mental illness, to see mental illness as something, other, scary and alien to people who who aren't suffering from that or consider themselves more neurotypical. And I think that, we've tried to move away from that. We've tried to say, all right, let's destigmatize. And a lot of times it's motivated for good reasons, but it involves a lot of medicalizing and attempting to reduce blame. So we say, well, somebody who has schizophrenia or major depression, they have a mental illness, and maybe they shouldn't be held responsible for their actions. But that does come at the cost of treating them as not having full agency.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a difficult kind of tension here. It can be kind of dehumanizing in a way to say, well, you're not really responsible, because you're not really a full-fledged agent. And yet it's motivated in the right place. But I think it leads us to this kind of simplistic view of saying, well, if somebody has mental disorder, mental illness, then that automatically says something about their agency or responsibility. But it does really matter, I think, how we theorize about this issue, because it can have this effect on how we treat people who do have mental disorders. And so I've tried to think through this as a puzzle, both about sort of metaphysics of freedom and responsibility, but also ethics, like how we ought to treat people who are suffering mental disorders.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you advocate for a more nuanced view on mental disorder and moral responsibility. Could you explain that view a little bit and tell us about some of the lines of support for it?
Yeah, this is actually a view I've really developed with my friend and colleague here at UAB in the philosophy department, Matt King.
Mm-hmm.
So he and I have been thinking about this for quite a few years now. And we start thinking that maybe, there is a little bit oversimplified picture here. We tend to think that just because somebody has a mental disorder, that says something automatically about their freedom or responsibility. And this more nuanced view at its base just really says that it doesn't imply anything. We really mean that too. Like, it implies nothing. The fact that somebody has a mental disorder doesn't really say anything, at least by itself, about someone's freedom or responsibility. Mm-hmm. And we want to say that, sure, sometimes mental disorders can impair someone's freedom and thus their responsibility. But it just depends on the case. So here we're back to that. It's inevitable.
The refrain.
Exactly. So, I mean, some philosophers might say, yeah, sure, maybe some disorders don't necessarily involve a reduction of agency, but others do, right? Like maybe schizophrenia, for example. You said that surely that's going to, impair someone's perceptions. They have, hallucinations, delusions. But even then, we think that's not quite nuanced enough, because there are cases, people with schizophrenia, where there's not so much of an impairment in agency. One of the best cases, I think, is of Ellen Sachs. She's this professor of law at USC, and she has this great book called The Center Will Not Hold, and also a TED Talk. And she talks about how she has battled schizophrenia for many years, and yet, she can live this very flourishing life as a professor at USC. And it's not as though she has just a certain subvariant of like mild schizophrenia or something like that. She does have like really serious episodes that have led her to be hospitalized. But, most of her life involves exercising a lot of great agency and freedom and rationality. And that's partly due to her environment. She's enjoyed a lot of support of family and friends and a workplace. So in that case, there are situations where she might have impaired agency, but it's not necessarily characteristic of her and her life. So similarly, we think we can't just say, well, for these kinds of disorders, there's a loss of agency, and for these other ones, they're not. It really just depends case by case. And even as Sachs's case illustrates, time by time. It's not just a matter of like what we can say about her, but also depends on the day or the week or, what's been going on recently for that person. Yeah. And really, we think this is kind of similar of neurotypical people as well. It just kind of fluctuates by the day, by the week, and depends on one's circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You go on in your chapter on mental disorder to discuss the ethical implications of your nuanced approach, including views on neurodiversity. Could you explain what you say there about cognitive continuity and how it's related to a neurodiversity approach to mental illness?
Yeah. So neurodiversity is just this idea that there's a wide range of brain function across the species. And the metaphor is usually biodiversity. With biodiversity, we think we're learning there are all the different kinds of species out there that are important to the healthy functioning of an ecosystem. And so we should value all those different kinds of species and not try to, eliminate any one of them. And so similarly, the neurodiversity view is that there's all this diversity of brain function, and we should value that as sort of normal diversity that's healthy for a sort of psychological ecosystem. But there is this neurodiversity paradigm, which just does really want to emphasize that we should treat these as valuable variations. The idea is that they're just mere differences, not deficits. It's kind of resisting this pathology paradigm where a lot of times we treat mental illness, mental disorders, or different neurological conditions as a deficit or a pathology that needs to be fixed. And so it says, no, it's a mere difference. And the real strict neurodiversity paradigm says that all of these variations are just mere differences, not a deficit. So whether it's autism, which is where this kind of discussion started, or even schizophrenia, ADHD, dyslexia, being deaf is another one that has been highlighted here. Mm-hmm. These are all meant to be just differences, not deficits. Now, a lot of the neurodiversity folks will say there may be deficits or impairments of a sort or disabilities, but usually that's just based on the society. So they'll draw on the social model of disability to say that it's just stigma, negative attitudes, lack of accommodations that are driving those impairments. Right. So we've seen a lot of that changing now, especially in the case of autism. So we see things like sensory-friendly concerts and a lot of trying to raise awareness about what autism is, but also things like ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, and trying to understand those things as just differences and don't have to be deficits if we have the right kinds of accommodations. And I think this is something that's been really valuable and important as a movement, but still with this kind of picture of it depends. I think we similarly have to say, well, it's tricky, it's complicated, and so we wouldn't want to say anything too flat-footed here. So I think that what we're learning from the neuroscience is that there is a lot of that variation. It's more like each person's brain is more like a thumbprint than a thumb. We all have thumbs, but each person's neurological function is more unique, like a thumbprint. Now, that also means that there are various kinds of cases. There are ones like Ellen Sachs, where she seems to be coping and flourishing with schizophrenia, but she also views that as an issue. When it does flare up, she views it as a deficit, as something she would like to fix, as not part of who she is and her identity exactly. And there are people who are autistic, like Temple Grandin, one of the most famous people who's really been successful and flourishing. And she says, if you could flip a switch and make me not autistic, I wouldn't take it. Right. But there are others who are very vocal and outspoken, like this Donna Williams. She's a writer, and she says, look, I see this as a problem, and if I could get rid of my autism, I would. So it's really tricky if we want to capture both Temple Grandin and Donna Williams, then we can't just say that it's always a mere difference and not a deficit. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I've actually been myself trying to really grapple with this lately. I only barely touch on it in the book, trying to figure out if we could have a framework for getting that kind of nuance that we were talking about before into discussions of neurodiversity. And it's a really thorny topic. I certainly don't have it all figured out. And I might even dare say that it's more thorny than the free will topic. But I don't know about that.
Among people who advocate for a neurodiversity approach, do they think that, or is the common view that all differences are just mere differences? Or are there extreme cases where even people who advocate for this approach are going to say, oh yeah, okay, this is just kind of like cutoff points?
I do think it depends on who you're talking about. And there's this big difference with neurodiversity between the movement. There's like the neurodiversity movement versus people who are theorizing about it. Mm-hmm. And so I think a lot of people who are in the movement, what they're calling for is a lot more understanding, accommodation, and lack of stigma. But the people who are theorizing about it, that the standard line is that there really is no such thing as a normal brain, that all of these differences are mere differences. People in the autism community who are proponents of the neurodiversity paradigm will say we should not talk about, severe extreme cases. It's not like there's, high functioning autism and low functioning.
Right.
Of course, those are normatively laden terms, but they also would say we shouldn't try to break down in subtypes. They would say all forms of autism are a mere difference, not a deficit. And for the severe cases that we might typically call it severe, they might say, well, of course, there are people who are autistic who have epilepsy, for example. And they often would not want to count epilepsy as a mere difference. For whatever reason, there are different theoretical frameworks for this. But they might say epilepsy is really as a deficit, but it's not part of their identity or who they are. And that's sort of separate. But the autism part is more like part of their identity and who they are. And, epilepsy is something separate. And so that can be a deficit. Of course, chronic pain is a deficit. But things that are tied to the person's identity is a mere difference. And if there's any disability or impairment, it's really just from society, from lack of accommodation or stigma. So there are a lot of interesting, I think, theoretical moves and tools for trying to say maybe it is always a mere difference and not a deficit. But there's a lot of interesting, things I think to hash out there.
Yeah. Yeah. The questions about what counts as part of your identity, like what's our framework for that too, I think are also interesting questions.
Right. Yeah. And I think that this is where the nuanced picture would still come in again, is that I don't know that we can say anything in general about what makes something part of someone's identity. That might be partly up to the individual, even if not entirely, but you'll have differences like Temple Grandin might say, this is part of my identity. But then Donna Williams will say not. Mm-hmm. And I think there is room for cases where someone might think that something's part of their identity, but then we say, well, maybe there's room to say it's not. Like if somebody is has antisocial personality disorder, a kind of like psychopathy or something, they might say, well, look, I know people think that I'm a little crass and callous, but that's part of who I am, right? There might be room for us saying that, look, it's not entirely up to you whether this is a mere difference. So I think it's just, again, really complicated. Now we're just getting into this territory of what the nature of well-being and mental health is. And I don't think there's going to be a straightforward, simple way of trying to count certain things as mere differences versus deficits. But what I would hope for is that we could maybe have a framework that would have the nuance to capture all this variation. So there might be some people who are, say, autistic or schizophrenia who view it as part of their identity or just as part of different kinds of experiences that they have, whereas others could view it reasonably as a deficit that they want to see fixed.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Josh. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
Well, wherever you find the truth, you can usually find my work.
I like that answer.
No, I'm not really active on social media or anything, but I do have a website, joshdmay.com. I do have summaries of the chapters from the book up there, as well as summaries of all the case studies that I talk about. I really hope that the book is more accessible, not just to philosophers, but people outside of that discipline or even outside of academic research. So I try to provide a lot of information up there about the book so that it might be read by more than just a handful of philosophers. Yeah. Maybe there's too much information up there. I don't know. And I think I'm hoping to continue writing about this stuff on neurodiversity, but I have been thinking a lot about other areas of social change, and I just think more about moral controversies generally. Mm-hmm. And one that I've been getting really into lately is factory farming and how to make moral progress on that. So I've been working with a co-author on some work on that, some articles and things. So I may post some other things up there about upcoming projects related to that.
Very cool.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thanks again, Josh.
Thanks for having me.
In our next episode, we will conclude our 8th season of the podcast, and we'll talk about the issue of taking responsibility. And our guest will be Eleanor Mason, professor of philosophy at the University of California, Santa Barbara.